My dearest students of course A403 on work values and ethics, this is chapter 6 on the compliance approaches. Welcome. Of the basic learning objectives of this chapter is to be able to describe the nature of ethical guidance like self-regulation, code of ethics, and regulatory agencies. So we shall discuss how we shall enforce ethical behavior inside the organization using self-regulations, codes of ethics, and resorting to anti-corruption agencies. Number 2 is to analyze what form of regulation is appropriate and under which circumstances. So when can we use codes of ethics? When can we resort to anti-corruption agencies? And so on. And number 3, which is to begin to develop a regulatory framework that includes all forms of regulation. So try to think or speculate about what different types of regulatory forms you can use in any organization. And here, I strongly urge you to go back to your topic of your team project and think about the different regulatory forms that were used in the organization that you chose. With regard to the key terms that we will discuss in this chapter, we have 4 basic key terms. Number 1 is the compliance approach, which is the use of laws and regulations to control unethical behavior. So as you see, these are external mechanisms that are used inside the organization to enforce ethical behavior, okay? Whether written in codes of ethics, whether written in the different professional codes, whether written in rules and regulations, or in laws. Number 2 is the integrity approach, and here it relies on using training, education, and integrity to curb unethical behavior. So here we do not impose external mechanisms or regulatory forms to enforce ethical behavior, but we simply socialize and educate our employees on how to behave in the different ethical circumstances. Number 3 is codes of ethics and codes of conduct, which are rule-based approaches. These are documents that include various statements on how to behave ethically in the organization, whether by telling you how to respond to the different circumstances, so mentioning rules, mentioning procedures, or whether one would mention certain values and principles, ethical values and principles, like integrity, like honesty, like transparency, and so on. And number 4 is the anti-corruption agencies. And these are agencies that are created specifically for overseeing unethical behavior. So oversight, monitoring, or for investigation. So if they received reports stating that there is unethical behavior in one of the organization, or if after overseeing behavior inside one of the organizations they found out that there is unethical conduct or something like this, they can investigate it. Or number 3, guidance of unethical behavior, where they would offer guidelines or training workshops on how to behave in the different ethical circumstances. Or a combination of all 3. So anti-corruption agencies can perform one or more of these 3 basic functions: oversight, investigation, and guidance. Now, given all the ethical dilemmas that the different organizations or various organizations face, 2 questions arise. Number 1, can we trust that public officials behave ethically on their own without any external guidance, without any external laws or rules imposed on them? Or should we introduce regulatory regimes like codes of ethics or anti-corruption agencies? So here, these 2 questions basically revolve around the basic 2 approaches: the compliance approach that emphasizing using regulatory regimes or frameworks in order to enforce ethical behavior inside the organization versus the other approach, which is the integrity approach that tries to um, maintain that people normally behave ethically and that if provided with the needed education, training, and integrity, they would behave ethically on their own without the necessity of having any external regulations imposed on them. These previously mentioned approaches, the integrity approach and the compliance approach, are considered by many as opposite ends of a spectrum, as contradictory, opposing each other, while in fact they complement each other and they try to overcome the negative aspects of each other. Since we are talking in this chapter about the compliance approach, so let us move on to the codes of ethics and codes of conduct. These, as I said before, include guidelines and sanctions. So they include written statements about how to behave ethically in the organization, as well as include sanctions on that are going to be imposed on those who are going to violate the written statements and guidelines. They would also cover a wide scope and range of practices because no code of ethics can be so detailed as to cover all possible ethical circumstances. So they should be written in a broad way, in a general way, to allow different interpretations and different application or implementation in the different circumstances. However, both are not so often distinguished from each other, but we can say that code of ethics usually emphasize ethical principles and ethical values, whereas codes of conduct mention more different rules on how to behave and how to face different ethical dilemmas. For example, a code of ethics would stress integrity, would stress honesty, impersonal relationships, or equality and fairness. Whereas a code of conduct would tell you you need to be friendly with your customers. You need to treat everyone with dignity and respect, and so on. They are necessary, both codes of ethics and codes of conduct, for those organizations that apply the compliance approach, but they're not sufficient. As we said, they will never cover 100% of all the circumstances that an organization would face. And there are actually two views regarding how to develop codes of ethics or conduct for any organization. The first view believes that a code of conduct can be externally imposed on an organization. So it can be developed outside the organization by maybe external consultants and imposed on the organization. However, in that case, people working in the organization would most probably consider this code of ethics as a controlling mechanism. And they would only follow or comply with it out of fear of sanctions and punishment, but they were not convinced by its necessity. The other view, on the other hand, believes that these codes should be internally developed with the participation of all the relevant stakeholders, and then they also should be embedded in the organization by conducting training, for example, or having workshops inside the organization that would educate the people about these codes, inform them about them, and so on. And also by building trust among the employees. These codes should not be considered as one way of distrusting the employees, but it should be considered as one way to offer guidance for the employees in case they were facing ethical dilemmas. So this all needs to be discussed and explained to the employees, and if that happens, this will build trust. Also, in order to embed codes of ethics and codes of conduct in the organization, your organizational culture needs to refer continuously to these codes of ethics and conduct so that people would always be informed about the different statements about the different rules and regulations and how to respond and so on. Because at time of crises, nobody has the time to start from the very beginning and be educated about the codes of ethics. But if they are continuously trained on them and the culture always refers to these codes and so on, then people would be acquainted to them. However, the effectiveness of these codes depends upon the context in which the organization exists. Usually, when people develop or when organizations develop codes of ethics, they are thinking about how to behave in the different possible circumstances that the organization might be witnessing. But at times of uncertainty, when things are unfamiliar and happen for the first time, sometimes no codes of ethics or no regulations might be explaining these circumstances. So in that case, the effectiveness of these codes might decline. So the codes are most effective when we are facing certain circumstances where all the practices are known and all the factors inside the external environment are clear. But in unclear, vague times, sometimes it's difficult that we would find already written statements for how to behave in these unfamiliar circumstances. A second factor that might increase the effectiveness of the codes is the content. That the content of these codes should be consistent, should be clear enough for all the employees to understand. And it should also be applicable to the different circumstances as much as possible. And number three, with regard to the factors that help increase the effectiveness of codes of ethics, is the implementation. Whenever organizations refer to these codes while working, while performing, and so on, people, as I said before, would always be acquainted with these statements and guidelines. So they would always implement the codes while they're working. But in case you don't refer to these codes, then when the time comes and you need to implement them, you would face difficulty. And number four is enforcement, which means using punishment or rewards based on whether the employees comply or violate these codes of ethics. So in case they comply, you need to reward them. In case they violate these codes, you need to look for a way for enforcement, whether to use punishment or something else. With regards to the characteristics of codes, well, number one, they should be clear. They should be understandable to all the employees and management. Everyone should understand them and should know exactly what is indicated in these codes. Number two, they should be consistent, meaning that all the mentioned statements should be harmonious and compatible with each other. They should not be contradictory, or otherwise they would lead to confusion. Number three, they should also be harmonious with legislation and rules. They should not violate any external laws or any external professional codes or any further rules inside the organization. No, they should be compatible with them. And number four, they should be, as much as possible, agreed upon by all the stakeholders. And it is important to involve the stakeholders while developing those codes, in case you were developing this view that emphasizes that the organization itself should develop its own code. So in that case, better involve all the stakeholders while creating or developing your own code of ethics to have this ownership of decisions in order to make sure that everybody would comply with these codes, and even if they disagree, but at least they have participated in the process and now they know that they must comply and so on. So in that case, involve all the stakeholders. Number five, codes have no specific set of principles, meaning that there is no rule of thumb here for the different principles that should be mentioned in the different codes. There is no one best way of writing a code, okay? However, the majority mention specific principles like accountability, because you have to hold your employees accountable for their actions, or integrity, or honesty, impartiality. Remember the rules of bureaucracy? And also serving the public, obeying the laws, and so on. Okay? And a further characteristic is that they better be positive in tone, meaning that instead of writing do not do this and this and this, but which is a negative tone, write your statements and rules in a positive tone. Please do this and this and this. Please respect your colleagues. Okay, please be honest with everyone. Please treat your customers with dignity, with respect, and so on. And finally, it is important to know that many countries have initiated codes for different groups, and usually we refer to these groups as different professions, maybe. So we have professional codes, or we might have also, of course, different codes for each and every organization. In recent years, the OECD has seen a growing tendency towards adopting broader guidance rather than detailed control. So it has been witnessing a move or a shift towards the integrity approaches rather than the compliance approaches. And they resort this partly due to moving away from rule-based public administration that emphasizes rules and regulations to result-based administration that focuses on the outcomes, on the results, and doesn't impose strict rules and regulations on how to behave in the different organizations, but tries to emphasize the results over the rule-based approach. However, the recommendation is to adopt codes that address both approaches, that offer guidance and detailed rules to a certain extent, not too detailed rules, as well as that offer also general statements that can be applied to the different circumstances. So they would advocate integrity-based codes that are somehow broad, and also compliance-based approaches that are detailed. Nevertheless, you should be aware of the negative aspects of each. So integrity-based codes are too general and difficult to be implemented, but they set a clear group or set of ethical principles. So they tell you the ethical principles that this organization is aspiring. Whereas the compliance-based codes are too detailed and sometimes can be very strict, okay, and accordingly inefficient, but they would mention clear rules and would guide behavior.